My name is Jonathan Shiell, and we are very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Mark Burdick, who will be answering questions on the subject, do parental expectations within the HDM burden students in both long-term and or short-term? Dr. Burdick is a clinical and forensic psychologist, as well as a licensed educational psychologist. He was the president of the California Association of Educational Psychologists and a former chair of the State of California Board of Behavioral Sciences. He has been qualified as an expert in both state and federal courts. He's well qualified to examine the subject, and his publications include Holding Kids Hostage, Ethical Considerations in the Assessment of Gifted School-Age Youth, and the emerging role of school psychologists as consultants of gifted students. So, Dr. Burdick, in your professional opinion, how would you define neurodiversity, and why is it important to consider in educational settings, especially in highly competitive environments like ours?
Well, thank you for having me, Johnny. I appreciate this, and it was a nice, warm introduction, and it's all true what you just said, so that's helpful. I think the subject of neurodiversity, is a concept. It's a movement as well as it is a condition, meaning that it recognizes the differences of variance in the human condition, but it really started decades ago when individuals were seen as different. They would often be seen as having some sort of obsessive compulsive disorder or some inattentiveness or some sort of idiosyncratic movement or behavior that people looked at and said, oh, well, this is somewhat a little different. And neurodiversity came along and said, yes, but we're all a little different. And we have our own little, pieces and bits to the puzzle. So when we look at autism or ADHD or dyslexia and these types of variants of the human brain, we don't just pathologize them. We don't make them pathological that need to be fixed. So I think the operant here is the fixing of it, right?
Yeah.
We are who we are, and it's not just neurons firing. It's really who we are. So I think that's the difference, and that's what's coming about with the neurodiverse movement.
So would you also define neurodiversity as, for example, kids with a higher IQ or higher cognitive functioning abilities?
Absolutely. So, back when that through general education, there came special education. And special education actually had one condition that you no longer see on IEPs, these individual education plans, which was gifted and talented. So you would have young people who are significantly gifted intellectually, or they have some amazing talent. And they recognize that those young people had needs beyond that of the general population, that they actually needed counseling or they needed support. They needed accommodations in the classroom. So yes, very much so, you look at kids that have a gifted condition or a talent condition that needs to be recognized by the school system.
Okay, so based on your experience, how do parental expectations affect children's mental health and academic performance, particularly in high-pressure academic environments?
Terribly. It's the parental expectation, whenever a parent looks at their child, they see themselves, right? So they look at the child and they say, okay, well, how come, Mark or Johnny or whoever it is not living up to my expectations, right? So that's what's going on with this parental expectation thing. They want to be, it's a tough job being a parent, first of all. I'm going to put a bit in here for parenting because it's not easy. Yeah. And it gets harder, increasingly harder in this day and age because there's so many different dynamics out there. But the parents, when they put on their own expectations about mental health and academic achievement, they look to strive for excellence. They may be unrealistic. They're overly demanding in their expectations, and that leads to stress, anxiety, and other conditions. So the children feel pressure to meet these expectations, and that leads to a fear of failure or perfectionism. So in the academic area, you've got burnout or you have disengagement. But conversely, if you look at low expectations, then you run the risk of negative effects, meaning that kids don't meet the challenges that are placed before them. So again, it goes back to parenting, and it's difficult being a parent because you need to balance that.
Can those parental expectations potentially have any long-term side effects?
Well, by definition, a side effect would be something that would be passing, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of long-term effects, you would hope that if the parents were doing their job correctly, that it would have positive effects, and you would see it in terms of maturation and academic performance and job performance. So I think, yes, you could say that there would be some negative effects that would come about, but that's because the parent is having difficulty with balancing how much support that that child needs and where to get that support. And I know you'll talk about that in a minute, but you're really kind of dealing with healthy development as well as academic success.
So can excessive parental pressure while in high school, let's say, have a negative impact on children when they're in their jobs later on in life?
I would say possibly, but not likely. When you're dealing with kids in high school, you're already above that developmental at risk place where when you get down into elementary, those early days are more formative. So if you get parental expectations way beyond that you can meet as a child that's under the age of, say, 8, I think that's more likely to lend itself to long-term effect, negative effect.
Okay, so how do cultural factors influence parental expectations, and what have you observed in your practice regarding different expectations across cultures?
Do you mean like Aborigines versus Euro-American cultures?
Different cultures, as in like different communities or groups of parents who expect different things.
So your father, his name's Warren.
Yeah.
And so Warren and I had a bit of a discussion on this, and I said, I think that there's something to be said about zip code cultures, where you live in a particular area, geographic area, where there's more pressure being put on those people than there are in other zip codes. So you can look at 90024, the Westwood, West End types of things, or Beverly Hills zip codes, or look at different zip codes around and you recognize that there is each in those zip code areas, there's a culture that emerges. Typically, in the more affluent areas, I think you have more pressure placed on kids, but that's because the parents they've chosen to perform. I don't know if they've learned to perform, but they've chosen to perform in such a way as they make themselves better in a social economic condition. I think it's also, something to be said about cultural factors, socioeconomic factors with people who have been brought up in very poor conditions. Some people in poorer conditions come forward and say, listen, I don't want to live this way. I'm going to be somebody. I'm going to do something. So you have that cultural component. The effectiveness or the predicated dominance of those that are on the spectrum or who have some neurodiversity in this way are more challenged, I think, because it's difficult for kids that have complex profiles to meet parent expectations in systems that require better performance. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So do you have like any anecdotes, let's say, or case studies that exemplify the impact of excessive parental pressure on children, particularly those identified as part of the neurodiverse spectrum?
I have parents who are always asking, who are struggling and clearly frustrated in their inability to reach kids on the spectrum. So they're looking towards executive coaching, what they call executive function coaching, or social skills or behavioral interventionists who are trained to reach and work with kids that are on that neurodiversity spectrum. It's a big business. Is it a needed one? Yes. There are certainly, those that think that it's an important business to have. Clearly, those who aren't parents have an easier time in working with kids than the parents do in certain ways. If you have executive function coach, or if you have someone who's working on social skills or behaviors, it's oftentimes better to have someone who's outside of the family who is working with the individual, with the student or child, than it is to have a parent working. Because again, going back to my opening where, parents see themselves in their children, it's sometimes difficult for them to get an unbiased and kind of more of a soft-handed approach.
Yeah. Okay, so what strategies can or should parents employ to support their children's education and well-being without imposing harmful pressure?
I would probably say that regular communication with teachers and counselors would be useful. And thinking further through that, I was even thinking in terms of therapists that could work with the family on communication skills, because I think that's really what it comes down to, is the ability to have open communication between family members. And for a mother or father who says, I oftentimes when you see with neurodiversity, you'll see parents who have those indicators themselves, so they're on somewhere on the spectrum. And so I think and they mask it well. As you get older, you get better at masking it. You get better at showing off a different side than the neurodiverse side. So you learn kind of within the system how to act. So I think it's really one of open communication. I think therapists can help. Certainly teachers and counselors can.
Okay, great. So what role can school counselors and educators play in balancing and mitigating the effects of high parental expectations on students?
So I think, again, open communication is going to be the highlight. That's a piece of the puzzle, and that counselors can address in terms of effective communication. I think the counselors and educators play a significant role if they've been trained in this area, right? Because not everybody's been trained in the area of working with kids that are neurodiverse. Some schools, for instance, I was also the administrator at Palo Alto Unified and worked with Stanford, right? And then also with Kaiser to bring in new ways of thinking and working with those that are on the spectrum. So I think if coaches, if the counselors and the teachers can utilize some of that university affiliation, it really goes a long ways towards their ability to work with kids.
Okay. So what advice would you give to students who potentially feel overwhelmed by the expectations placed on them, especially those who might be listening to this interview today?
Run away from home. That's one, possibility. No, you don't have to run away from home. I think, we're all people, right? So I think it's important for you to develop hobbies and interests and ways to kind of unpressurize all of that stuff, right? So how kids do it today, in fact, is they go into the basement or into their own room and they turn on the computer and they game for hours on end, right? That's effective to a certain point, but I think really in all honesty, life is balance, and you can only take, we live in a very pressurized society, right? So once you are in work and your father and your mother, everybody can talk about these things. There's a lot of pressure on parents to work constantly. So you as a child, as the offspring, that's passed on to you, that you have to work constantly, but you don't. There's the tip of the day. You can do things that are fun. You can go out and play sports. You can go out and, learn chess. Read books for fun. You don't have to read necessarily academic books. So there's a lot of things that you can do for yourself so that you teach yourself how to be balanced. So you keep yourself away. It's easy to, it's what I would say to the listeners, it's easy to blame the parents in this regard, right? Because the parents are the ones that are hounding you. But it's really up to you to take that and say, listen, I'm going to live a balanced life. I'm not going to buy into this, 24/7 stuff. I'm going to do some things that are fun. Just go skiing, go swimming, go do something besides academics.
Okay, so looking forward, how do you think that educational systems and parental approaches need to evolve to better support neurodiverse students in achieving their potential without, say, undue stress?
Well, again, we could leave it to educational systems and parental approaches and these sorts of things. But I also do think that, and I mentioned already about Palo Alto, university-connected schools and this sort of a thing, that to bring your school to be more forward-thinking, you can have your administration get help from universities. But I also think that kids can help their own parents, and they can help their own schools with plenty of resources that are out there. There's some excellent books on this. And I could see how you could set up a chapter within a school and say, we're going to have the neurodiverse and call it, I don't know, the Green Leaves Movement or whatever you want to call it, and say, we want to teach you how to work better with us. Take a more commanding role in this than necessarily just, a fold back position. You could actually come out and say, this is, we're part of a group and we need for you to be better educated.
Okay, great. So thank you for coming out today, Dr. Burdick.
My pleasure, Johnny. I'm happy to speak with you anytime.